Hello, listeners. I'm Ronald Young Jr., and today we have a very special episode of Leaving the Theater. I'm on the couch reviewing the Netflix series Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. So for those of you that have never listened to Leaving the Theater before, I don't know that I would recommend starting with this episode because I take a bit of a different approach to reviewing this. I don't strictly stick to the work as art. I kind of go deeper into the existential reasons why work like this exists. So I don't want new listeners to think that this show is always me doing that all the time. Most shows, I'm having fun reviewing whatever I just watched. For veteran listeners, this episode is not indicative of me changing the direction of the show. I just had a lot of real feelings about what I saw, and I felt like I had something to add to the conversation about Jeffrey Dahmer, his victims, and the show as a whole. So let this episode stand out as a one-off, but it is certainly not the normal format for this show. Also, let this serve as a trigger warning. This episode will allude to the violence of a serial killer. We don't get graphic in this episode, but if you don't want to hear about any of it, I'd skip this one. As always, if you want to engage me in conversation, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at OhitsBigRon, and we can talk further about it. So with that, I'm Ronald Young Jr., and I'm on the couch. Check. All right, this is Ronald, and I am on the couch after watching Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. This was created by Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan, starring Evan Peters, Richard Jenkins, Molly Ringwald, Michael Learned, and Niecy Nash. For a complete list of the cast, check the link in the show notes. All right, so lots of hullabaloo about this show. There is, a lot of family members of the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer did not want this to exist. They were very upset about having to relive the trauma, backlash on people who were deciding to watch the show, and the ethics behind choosing to watch a show like this. Are you participating in the trauma, in the harm? A lot of those questions came up as this show came to exist. For those that don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer who killed 17 people. He killed them in pretty grotesque ways. And after they died, he did awful, unspeakable things to their bodies. If you want to know more about this, you can Wikipedia it. I don't want to get into those gruesome details as I'm talking about this show. I have a couple of things to say about the show. I think it's a well-acted show. It's well performed. It's well directed. There's a lot of the show that is put together well. Something that you would expect from Ryan Murphy if you've seen some of his past works, including American Horror Story, American Crime Story. I believe he did Popular, and there was another show. I think he did Glee. I'm not sure if he did Glee. I have to double check it. But he has quite an extensive catalog of shows that he's done. This was tough. This was tough for me to watch. For many reasons. I think there's something to be said here about our obsession with true crime. And I'm going to get ranty there. So before I get into that, let me just talk about the show. The acting is very good. I can't really say anything negative about the acting. I think Evan Peters does a great job as Jeffrey Dahmer. He is very creepy, very awkward, very unsettling to watch him on screen. I, found myself actively rooting against him, of course, as I should. I think that there's some parts of this performance that are better than others, but I think the most noteworthy part is probably around before he dies, where there's a bit of acting he does in that scene that I think was pretty remarkable. But we'll talk about the problems later. I don't think any of the problems of this come from the actors. I think Niecy Nash did an outstanding job. She acted very well. I really believed her. She was the neighbor who was accusing Dahmer, who kind of like suspected he was up to no good the entire time, but was not believed by the Milwaukee police. And Richard Jenkins plays Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, and he does an excellent job because he essentially goes from being a father who's conflicted and confused about his son to he goes on a journey over the course of the season. And it's just well acted. I think the one thing that I thought while watching the season was that, this isn't really, I'm not going to get at the actors for performing as they're told, doing the scripts that they're given, doing the performances that they're supposed to be doing. I'm not really going to get at any of that stuff. Those portions will say, come Emmy time, I'm not surprised if people are nominated for the performances I saw in this. Now let's talk about the story. I definitely think that our obsession with true crime has kind of brought us to a pretty dark place. And we know that true crime sells, whether it be podcasts, whether it be television shows. We know that true crime sells. And we know that there's an appetite for it. Otherwise, a show like this wouldn't exist. This wasn't even the show that I was planning to release this week, but it's number 1 on Netflix, which means, I try to release the shows in line with what people are talking about, just to make Leaving the Theater be a part of the conversation. And I remember hearing about Dahmer a couple of weeks ago and thinking, yeah, maybe I'll do that in a few weeks, and then hearing about the backlash and then being conflicted about whether I was going to talk about it. And then I remember seeing that it was still number 1 for a while, and listening to people talk about it and seeing the conversation and see it stay in that number 1 position for a while. And maybe that had to do with some of the controversy and people thinking that they had to watch it for themselves. Then watching it and seeing arguably a very compelling show kind of pushes it and keeps it in the number 1 position. I think that this story I think it's irresponsible that this exists. I think that I recognize a documentary, a podcast that tells the story of a true crime. And I think it tends to be some idea of salaciousness or leaning into, the gruesome details when it comes to a murder. I recognize how people lean into that stuff sometimes. And I recognize that people have an appetite for it and they're listening to it and they're thinking about it a lot. And I think, back in the day, podcasts like Criminal and of course, Serial kind of like wet a lot of people's beak into true crime. And there was always novels and stuff that people used to read. And it felt like, reading about them, there was always like this kind of separation because you were just reading about facts. When we've crossed over into a place where we're now dramatizing the facts, I think that's dangerous. And maybe you start with something like American Crime Story, O.J. Simpson, and it feels less innocent because we're talking about a trial. it feels less heinous, I should say, because we're talking about a trial. We're not necessarily talking about the murder. Like, O.J. Simpson was exonerated. He was found not guilty. Now I'm like forgetting what the word exonerated means, but you guys can yell at me about that later. He was found not guilty. So it feels different from this. This from a man who mutilated his victims essentially after they were dead, and he lured them into a trap and put them in positions where they couldn't leave, and then murdered them. 17 people, many of them black and brown. And I think if there's a universe in which this show existing is entirely ethical, then I think it's a fine show. Well acted, good storytelling. However, I don't think we live in that universe. And since I think Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't deserve depth, I first want to mention everything that I don't really care about here. I don't care about Jeffrey Dahmer's origin story that's in this movie. I don't think that we need to know what happened to him growing up. I don't think we need to know what happened to him as a child. I don't think I needed to watch him make out with a mannequin. And I'm saying that because I think there was a lot of portions of the show that kind of said, hey, look at this sexual deviant. Isn't it clear that he would do something like this? Which I think is kind of a cop-out for anybody whose sexual appetites, sexual tastes deviate from the norm. It automatically puts you in a position where you can't do that thing you like or that thing that turns you on because it's considered to be deviant behavior. And I think a few times the show got a little too on its high horse about that. I don't like that. It feels like, why are we deciding what behavior is deviant enough to be stylized as weird on a television show? That feels dangerous, because it feels like now we're deciding what's weird and what's not based on this very true story of this man who did all these horrible things to people. It feels wild to me on the one hand to say that Jeffrey Dahmer is a weirdo that kills and eats people, then through sound design and camera angles attempt to kind of show the victims as gullible when Dahmer was luring these people in. Watching this, I remember I'd like to know less about Dahmer, more about why people would be in a position that would make them susceptible to being lured. I think there's a few times where it kind of talked some about the victims, like them being trusting or them being in some sort of need, but it didn't do enough that I felt like the victims had any sort of agency. And I know people are probably listening to this thinking, well, there's that one episode, and I feel like that one episode was kind of like lip service on the part of the creators of the show, because they're just kind of saying they're giving humanity to one character who they are, then who is going to die. And we have to, like, essentially, they don't make us watch him die, thank God. But I mean, he's going to die. He dies. And it just felt like, why give this humanity to him? What was the purpose of that except to, like, give us false hope? I mean, it's a dark show. We know that we're talking about a serial killer here. I don't know why it's important to stylize stuff like this. And I thought it was, like, way too artsy to be about a serial killer. Like, there was just so many things where they're, like, holding the camera on certain angles and putting in the music in a certain way, and even, like, the lighting, all of that, where they're trying to evoke something. And you could read the Wikipedia page and evoke something on your own and have your own feelings of disgust, but to have someone orchestrate it to make you feel it feels like we've crossed a Rubicon when it comes to true crime. Like, if we're at a place now where, because I feel like what's next, is it Jeffrey Dahmer the musical? You know, like, at what point are we taking something horrible that happened in our history and setting it to a score and dramatizing it so that there's no more logic in there anymore. It's evoking emotion, and I just don't think that's the right move. I mean, why do I care if Dahmer was accepted by his classmates or not? Why do I care if Dahmer snuck into the National Honor Society picture? Why am I watching Jeffrey Dahmer masturbate? Why is there a score? Why is his story important to be told? It just felt like so many parts of this show were about showing what Dahmer was doing and showing the mind of a serial killer, which I'm sure is interesting to some people. But I think we have to start, like, questioning, why are we so intrigued by this? Like, why are we consuming this in the way that we are? And I felt it felt irresponsible. I even feel like, and I understand that I'm a part of the machine now because I'm reviewing it right now. I'm reviewing it. So I get that I'm a part of it, but like, this isn't something that I would have watched on my own. I don't know if I would have watched it at all if not for doing this show, you know? And And granted, I know I have the choice and all that. It's no one forced me to do this, obviously, but it still feels to be a part of this great big machine that's kind of like forcing us to relive disgusting and gruesome details, but like more stylized and with pizzazz, you know? There's a portion of the show, because the first half of it is just very biographical. And I think the show is worse when it's talking about Dahmer, when we're close in on Dahmer, when we're learning about Dahmer. I think that's when this show is doing its most irresponsible work. It felt more responsible when it's talking about the people around Dahmer, his parents, his neighbors, the cops, all the actions and things that folks took in order to try to stop, the ways in which the criminal justice system failed. I think that's interesting. And I think that this was 10 episodes, 10 very long episodes. I mean, it was like 45 and 50 minutes a piece. There was an hour and 5-minute episode in there too. There were very long episodes. And I think this probably could have been done in 6 if you cut out a lot of like the backstory about Dahmer. Now, granted, I think people are saying, well, this was a complete story and all that, and you get an arc. But I don't think that the true life was that much of an arc. And when you think about the victims, I just think that I don't know that this did any service to them. You know, there's a card at the very end of the show where they put all the victims' names on the screens, but it makes me realize that kind of like our obsession with true crime, our obsession with the murderers is kind of what makes victims just a name on a list. And now, but what we actually talk about is Jeffrey Dahmer. We don't talk about the victims. We talk about Dahmer. It's called Dahmer. The face on the front is Evan Peters as Dahmer. You know, it doesn't feel like it's meant to be in memoriam of the victims at all. And it's not, because, I mean, at the bare minimum, I mean, this is entertainment. We're talking about entertainment here. And I guess that's kind of like, it made me question what I'm doing, what we're all doing, if like we're at a point now where we're turning real horrible, scary things into entertainment in a way that I don't think we should be doing. I think we should all watch this and be like, nah, I don't know about like this. Maybe we don't do this one. Maybe we don't need BTK the musical. You know what I mean? Maybe we don't need another review of John Wayne Gacy. Like maybe we don't need that. And this show felt very much like that. There's ways in which they made his mother seem like she was just the worst, and I just don't know if that's true. You know, there's parts in which they tell this story that make it a well-told story as a fiction, but to know that it is real, and there's people out there that are going to have thoughts about this because it's real life. And I'm not talking about a biopic. And y'all know how I feel. I'm not a big fan of biopics, but like at least with a biopic, you say, hey man, y'all didn't really get it right about me. Y'all didn't do it right about me. In this case, we're talking about people's grief, like people that may have processed their grief. And now we've turned the story of their killer into something that does not feel like it's reprimanding Jeffrey Dahmer or it's like going after them. It's something that feels more objective about Jeffrey Dahmer. And I feel like it's okay to say that he was truly a monster, and there's no one that should be celebrating him. There's no one that should be happy about this at all. You know, like this isn't, I think that you have to take a position on things like this because I don't want to be in arguments in the streets about whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster or was he just misunderstood, which I think in some cases this show flirts with the line. It flirts with the line of saying, is it okay that he did this? Or is it a problem of a failure of parenting or any of that? I just think at some point you have to lay the blame of the feet of the person that did it instead of us like asking the question, like we're playing devil's advocate in a way that it's not productive or healthy for any of us. I think we have to, this ain't it. You know what I mean? This ain't it. And I watched 10 episodes of this. And I remember I thought I didn't think I would get past 4 or 5. And then it starts to change. Like in the last half of the show, we start to get away from Dahmer and we start talking about the people around Dahmer. And I think that is the more important story that needs to be told, which is the impact of this person. I think at one point the movie even says, it talks about them studying Dahmer's brain. And at one point they say, we can't be too obsessed with the why. We just need to put this behind us and find closure. And I remember thinking about the movie, like the movie is obsessed with the why. The movie is obsessed with showing us Dahmer as a character and all that. The movie is obsessed. The TV series is obsessed with this, you know? So if the TV series is obsessed with it, how are you going to end this TV series, make commentary about media consumption and all of this if you're a part of it, you know? It feels hypocritical in that way. This wasn't my favorite. And I think I can be objective enough to say that the storytelling was good if I didn't know it was real, and the acting was great, again, if I did not know that these people aren't characters, that they were humans. And in this particular story, I just don't know that it was responsible or ethical in the way that it was executed. So because of that, I'm going to give this a no rating. I'm not going to rate it. I think if you want to watch it, go ahead. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone. I would probably go into a longer version of this rant if anyone started asking me about it. But I don't think that it feels like a struggle that this is real and that it exists. And I think it kind of says a lot about where we are as a society today. I'm going to keep doing these reviews. It's not like I'm going to stop. This isn't something that's going to stop me. And I'll probably feel a lot of different ways about this in the days and weeks to come. And I'll probably have a lot of conversations about this in the days and weeks to come. But this was, this ain't it. So yeah, I'm not going to give it 0 stars. I'm not going to give it 5 stars. I'm going to give it a nothing. This is a no rating. The first one from Leaving the Theater. Well, I'm on the couch, but you know. And with that, Leaving the Theater is a production of OhitsBigRon Studios. Thomas Tyra of Bias Studios mixes the show. Thank you, Tom. Show art from Heather Wilder. Theme music by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. For more information about Dahmer, check out our show notes. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at OhitsBigRon. That's at OhitsBigRon. You can find out more about this show and other OhitsBigRon Studios shows by following us on Instagram at OhitsBigRon Studios and on Twitter at OhitsBigRon Stew, STEW. Leaving the Theater will be back soon, but until then, I'll be here on the couch.